welcome back to a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. I am your host, Ian Prize, and today I am joined again by Ryan Robison.
I don't know why I wanted to say top of the morning, because it's not, but here we are.
Top of the evening, bottom of the evening, actually, and Brian Gann. Hello, Brian.
Good day, Ian.
Good day to you. So, we are talking today about the third in our King Crimson trilogy, Red. So, we just left King Crimson with Starless in the Bible Black, the semi-studio-ish, semi-ish, live-ish album, but as was his wont, Robert Fripp looked at someone in the band and said, "I want to fire you." So he fired the violinist David Cross, and then said, "Actually, just kidding, I want to disband this whole situation." So, with Robert Fripp just sitting in the corner of the room making little knife signs at the other two, they went back into the studio for one final album, which of course was 1974's Red. So before we talk about the album, we have reached a critical milestone. This is the last of our canonical prog albums. So before we do the album today, I just want to thank all of you for listening so far. This is the end-ish of season 2. We've got a few special episodes, but thank you all for listening. Rate us wherever you're listening. Tell a friend who enjoys prog rock.
Tell a friend who doesn't like prog rock. Have them listen too.
Have them listen to Fracture.
I think this is such a great way to end this section of the podcast because it's a perfect bridge to music that's probably a lot more well-known and accessible to modern listeners. So for those of you that don't know, in 2012, Taylor Swift did a song-by-song remake of Red, Taylor's version. I know, rumored Lark's Tongue Aspect is next, and then maybe, who knows where we'll see from there. Tarkus, Taylor's version.
Oh.
I was going to say we're not going to go down this path. I was like, God damn, I would have such a morbid curiosity if they were like, oh, by the way, we're doing Gates of Delirium with Charlie XCX. I'd be like, I want to know so badly.
I need to hear this.
And then I think for the non-prog people, we're going to cut all this out, by the way, but for the non-prog people, I think just to wake up to Spotify one day and you're like, what the fuck? Charlie XCX did a 23-minute song? I'm so intrigued. So anyways, thank all of you for listening, and on to King Crimson's Red. So the first thing I'm going to chuck out to you guys, obviously as we were talking about, they've road tested all of these songs, but do you think this album more generally benefits from being a studio album?
Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you guys for listening. This episode of...
Yeah.
Way more focus than the previous two, especially Starless. I think they've refined this era. It's a little sad it's this late. Obviously, it's the last one with Mr. Wetton. But I think this is definitely the best of this era of King Crimson, and maybe the best overall album of King Crimson. That is debatable for me, but very much enjoyed this one.
You're not alone in that, Brian. A lot of people think it might be their very best. That's, you're not alone in that at all. It's short, too. It's only 40 minutes, give or take. I think that's the shortest record they ever made. And I think part of what helps that, too, is there's technically only 3 of them, right? There's only 3 cooks in the kitchen at this point. Everybody else is a guest star, and that really helps.
Yeah.
Interesting thought, given this is probably our last time with King Crimson, and I don't think we've discussed this on the pod before, but keep me honest here, Ian. Robert Fripp has a bit of a reputation, and I'm going to qualify this, of being, and you obviously cannot see my air quotes, of being hard to work with.
Yes.
From what I've read, though, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, it's not so much that he's hard to work with, but he has insanely high standards for you to be in King Crimson. So if you can be at his level, like you're the Bill Bruford of drums, you're Bill Bruford, you can contribute, you can collaborate, you can have a voice, literally or figuratively, in the band, but you have to be on his level. And if you're not, you're forgettable.
Yes, I would say that's probably true. And I also think that he was feeling it so hard that I think it's as soon as something felt off, he kind of ditched, which is why he basically dissolves 3-4 versions of the band before this album. And like it was, by John and Bill's recollection, it was him who dissolved this version as well, where he's just like, I'm not feeling it anymore. So I think from like a technical point of view, there's no question that Bill and John were able to like keep up with him kind of lick for lick. I think just the fun or whatever that thing is was fleeting for him, and then he disappeared again. And then obviously, we'll get to it at the end, but he goes off to a commune after this. So I think he had a lot of stuff he needed to go figure out. And then the other thing to think about all of this is from the time he entered the music industry, circa 1968 or whatever, to this album is a easy breezy 5 to 6 years. That's a breakneck pace considering they've done 7 studio albums, plus he did Giles, and Fripp. Like, he obviously worked like a demon. They toured for all of this. I suspect he was a haunted soul. So there's that.
Brian's saying, like, I don't know if he's hard to work with. He just has really high standards. It's like that joke from the show New Girl. Somebody says it's a Zoe Deschanel's character. It's not you. It's the things that you say and the way you behave.
No, and actually... No, I mean, actually, there's a deep point there, and this is the Michael Jordan thing. So if you're going to be the best, and you're going to be the best in a team sport, which is playing in an improvisational band, it must torture you all the time that you don't feel like you're performing to the best of your abilities, and your lackluster teammates aren't, or the audience wasn't receptive enough, or whatever it is. You must be running on fumes all the time. So this is a high-octane album for a high-octane band. Go Bulls. So we start with the title track, Red. So in keeping with the theme we've been talking about, this is just a refined version of Fracture. So it's got the same kind of aggressive tonalities. We've got the devil's interval, the tritone, as the riff, creating that harmonic tension that we so love. But it's a crisp song. And it feels a lot more, I don't know, like Any Color You Like or YYZ or something, where it's just like, oh, this is a nice instrumental. They have a riff, they play the riff, they rock to that riff, let's move on. So one interesting theorem I have about the song, so, we've talked about how this and I'm going to say probably their first album compete for the best King Crimson album of all time. I actually feel like this song kind of loops back around to 21st Century Schizoid Man, where it starts aggressive, gritty, and obvious riff. Obviously, this is an instrumental, but this is as like, we're going to grab you and hold on. And what a way to start an album.
I feel King Crimson, and by King Crimson I mean Robert Fripp, gets so close to inventing what we would later call heavy metal, but we don't quite get there. And then it's also interesting to think, after a long hiatus, they come out with 80s King Crimson and Indonesian folk music. Like, you almost did it, Robert. You almost invented metal, but not quite. But am I wrong in that this is the hardest they ever rock? It's probably the hardest a classic prog rock band would ever rock, specifically in this album.
Yeah, I mean, like the bass tone is massive. Obviously, Bill Bruford's like hitting some sort of steel sheet behind him. Like,
literally playing metal.
Sound. Literally playing metal. No, and I think you're absolutely right. This is some of the hardest. And, as I talked about, the tritone at the top, that down, down, down. I mean, that's a Black Sabbath riff, just straight up. And so I think they are basically at metal. The only thing they're missing is a straightforward song. And, probably a lot more lyrical content about about Satan and stuff. So we skip ahead to one more, Red Nightmare. So the song is very, very simple lyrically. It's about being flight phobic. And at the very end, after this horrible, scary plane ride, the narrator wakes up and it turns out he was on a Greyhound the whole time. Fabulous. I think this song as well really demonstrates how full their sound is, and this is a Bill virtuosic performance. Like, I think because this song has so many drums, and so did Red, I think you can, Bill just fills every second of the song with stuff.
It's not intrusive though. It's not distracting to the point where it's like Bill, cool your jets. Like nobody wants to hear this. It's not the 10-minute drum solo or anything. It's just perfectly woven into the rest of the music.
Yeah. And again, I think this is the secret of their kind of orchestration, and, you know, probably good that they were a very tight 5, then 4, then 3 piece. I think everyone finds a place to kind of hang out. And the other thing that's really nice is whilst Robert Fripp's sound is pretty big, he's actually very good about hanging back and letting Bill take over. So I don't feel like the guitar and the drums are ever competing. They are woven together. And then the other interesting thing that this song has is Ian MacDonald, last of In the Court fame, comes back to play an alto sax solo.
This is where I think King Crimson gets the closest they ever do to like a Pink Floyd sound. This song is absolutely on my top 5 King Crimson song list. I really like this song. I think the lyrics are fun. This is probably also top 2 John Wetton vocal performances, along with Night Watch.
Yeah.
I think this is some of the best use of his voice, so I really enjoyed it.
I was going to say he projects so well. Like, you can hear that he's a club singer. You know, I think, actually, funnily enough, Greg Lake was always meant to be a stadium singer. But, like, you can hear that John Wetton, like, is great at kind of projecting in a club. And, yeah, I think he brings a gravitas, I guess, to this song. Do you have any thoughts about how fun it is?
I think Ian MacDonald is a big part of that, because I think most people might know that he also goes on to found Foreigner.
Oh, yeah, of 80s fame.
Which is a shift in tone from King Crimson for sure. But yeah, I think having somebody like him show up here is like, oh, he knows how to have fun. And you know, you get into that section that Brian's talking about where we're really starting to break it down with some sax and some rocking out. No one's doing anything weird or
No, and actually, I was going to say, I actually think that's something else about this album that they really kind of shaved down on. I guess, obviously, with the exception of the 4th track, which we're not going to talk about, Providence, the really aimless noodling is completely gone. These really directed solos are en vogue for this album. And it's such a King Crimson thing to just have, like, hit a groove and then build, but groove is the operative word there. Like, it's not fudging around. They hit a groove, and then they play with the groove, and I think it's such a good feeling to have that.
Feels like the first time. Sorry, that was
Shame on you.
Yeah.
Shame on you.
Here's a weird question, and obviously there's only one person that could answer this, but if you're Bill Bruford, when you look back on his incredible career, who do you think he will associate with more, like King Crimson or Yes, or many of his other projects? So you know how in like professional sports, players might play for one team for a long time and then like jump around, but sometimes they'll sign a one-day contract and like retire with that team maybe they got most famous on. When Bill Bruford finally retires, do you think he'll sign with Yes or King Crimson?
I think he'll always consider him ABWA, the apex of his career.
You know, I get the sense that he appreciated his time with Yes. You know, obviously King Crimson is the thing that kind of made his name and his fame and his money and stuff. And I think he, you know, I'm assuming he's appreciative of that. But it's like, I think King Crimson and then later his extensive fusion jazz career are the things that made his kind of life rich and artistically fulfilling. So I don't know.
It's almost like in movies, right? He wouldn't typecast himself. He's a character actor. He didn't have any one big role in some huge blockbusters. Yeah, character actor. He's done all sorts of stuff, and everyone loves it.
And I was going to say, I think also, you know, he comes in at the top ranking of like rock drummers of all time. So I think, you know, he made his name. I think this is also just a different philosophy on art, because if I was Yes, I would schlep around the world just playing close to the edge and stuff and getting adulation and love. Then I think there's the Bill Brufords who are like, unless I'm having fun, no one else gets to have fun.
That's healthy.
And no, and not to say he's a jerk or anything. He sounds like a really nice guy. And obviously he did the Union Tour, which was Yes's greatest hits circa 1991. But I think there's two different philosophies on art. Like, do you want to do complete fan service on one end, or do you want to do complete you service on the other end? And there's all sorts of spectrums in between. Eyes up here, Ryan. Eyes up here.
No, that's just a really unfortunate turn of phrase.
Anyways, that's all I got for you. So we end on probably one of the best King Crimson songs of all time, one of my favorite King Crimson songs of all time, and just an all-around showstopper. And I'm so glad that they got to end this kind of first run with Starless. So Starless was originally a John Wetton piece that he kept shopping around to them, and eventually they're like, yeah, screw it, we'll finally do it. Stitched, interestingly, to a Bill Bruford bass solo. He doesn't play the bass, but this was his idea of that like constant build in the second half of the song. So this song has obviously an amazing melody, very good, very normal lyrics, but it gave us the thing we have been waiting for, where they took one riff and made it into a song. So the riff is incredible, creamy jazz tone and everything. And we'll talk about when it comes back in after the solo, but it's got an amazing riff. The other thing that this really makes you realize is like good guitarists have riffs, great guitarists do their crazy solos and stuff, and the top, this pro guitarists, just do one note which just keeps building and building and building. And that leads us nicely into the solo. So obviously the first 4 minutes are pretty normal John Wetton song, and then we have this creeping bass riff by Bill Bruford, and then Robert Fripp just playing one note, and then Bill Bruford soloing on a woodblock. And even though there's just those three elements, it's an incredible build. And then we come out of that solo into the blistering sax solo with guests Ian McDonald and Mel Collins, who were on the early albums, followed by the riff again as played on these woodwind instruments. Yeah, proving that context is absolutely everything with these great riffs. When it comes back in at the end, I lose my mind.
Why do you think this is the only time that happens where they write a riff, there's a song, everything is straightforward? Why do you think this only happens once?
I'll qualify that with only once during this era of King Crimson.
Stuff after this, though, I don't know.
Well, 21st Century Schizoid Man does the same trick where they have then a song, then a jazz build, and then the riff. I think this era of King Crimson, they just, I don't know, had to get complicated, I guess. And it's not to say, like, I feel like this is the lesson learned. So we've listened to them down in the lab doing their experiments, and now they've come up, and this is the thesis they wrote at the end about, like, okay, we've tried out all that stuff, all the tonalities, all of the ways of doing a solo, all the ways of structuring a song, and this is the thing that works. We've got a riff, we've got John Wetton's powerful voice, we've got Richard Palmer James's beautiful lyrics. We've got all this amazing orchestration. We've got Bill Bruford going to town, and we brought the woodwinds back. Here's what works in a song. Let's show it to you now. And then we'll dissolve the band.
I mean, can you call it a magnum opus?
I mean, for me, this is their best song, easily. I think this is probably everything that makes this era of King Crimson and King Crimson more generally fantastic.
I do think this song is pretty incredible. This is actually on one of my, probably one of the few King Crimson songs that actually hits my regular rotation. I'm very much an album guy in our age of Spotify, but King Crimson, I do find myself jumping around more than other artists I enjoy. Yeah. But I do think this is as good as it's get. To go back to our kind of discussion of metal, I don't think Robert Fripp probably ever rocked as hard as he did on this song. Maybe he rocked so hard, that's why they took a 7-year hiatus after this. He burnt himself out. But I love the floaty mellotron. It also, the beginning, almost gives me early King Crimson vibes. It's almost like a Wake of Poseidon.
But less dated sounding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that ending jam around the 11-minute mark when the bass is going crazy, the guitar is going crazy, fucking perfection.
And I was going to say, I think that's the secret of this song. As I was saying, I think it's kind of like their thesis. It's the retrospective where we look back, and they literally brought back Mel Collins and Ian MacDonald from the early days. I think the idea that it's like, yeah, here's a soft Mellotron song like we used to do, followed by here's a jazz freak out like we do now. Yeah, wonderful. And then I think again in that terms of just the perfect orchestration of like, even though the song's 12 minutes, you don't feel it. Normal song, very easy build, blistering solo, and then because it loops back around to that just gorgeous riff, fantastic. Full circle, completely satisfied. So, I guess my final few thoughts on this era of King Crimson. So, first, because it's a minor thought, so they brought Richard Palmer James in for this era. They had Peter Sinfield in the last era. I really wonder if having a dedicated lyricist means you get to have really cool lyrics about a bunch of diverse subjects. I genuinely wonder if it expands your lyrical color palette.
Well, I think it has to, because kind of old standby where, the lead singer usually writes most of the lyrics, or it is, whoever is the front man.
Yeah.
How often does this happen, though, where the lyricist is a member of the band? It's not, they're not outsourcing it. It's not like somebody else writing lyrics for the band, but this is actually they are a member.
I was going to say, I think the only other really formidable example I can think of this is the Grateful Dead with, Robert Hunter.
All he did was write lyrics, and he's a full-fledged member of the band.
I suspect because so many people were on tour with the Grateful Dead, I think he was around. But he's, he is as integral to their experience as any of the others are. His lyrics are what makes the Grateful Dead the Grateful Dead. So I don't know physically how often he was on tour with them, but I suspect quite a bit. I don't know what else he did when he wasn't writing lyrics, but he's crucial to their thing. I don't know how many other times a dedicated lyricist is that integral into the band.
To your point, Ryan, the only other example, Grateful Dead was an interesting one. The only other example, and it's not a great example, would maybe Elton John. Obviously a solo artist, but he is, I think, heavily associated with Bernie Taupin.
Yes, that's true.
And I can't think of many other people, a true non-musician. I don't think Bernie is a musician in any traditional sense, but he's a lyricist.
And is crucial to the project of Elton John. And actually, he's another good example of this kind of phenomenon I'm talking about. Elton John has very cool lyrics about a diversity of subjects. And I do wonder if kind of being a full-time lyricist means you have the poet's soul, rather than, and I say regressing to the mean as if it's a bad thing, but the fact that you'll just be okay, I need to come up with another song. Well, what's the words that kind of fit this? And I'll just kind of slap them together. And not to disparage him, but I think that's where the Greg Lakes come in, where it's they have kind of cool lyrics, I guess, but it really feels like he's just I need some words that sound cool. Let me throw them on this and on that and whatever else. I just think, how cool to have a song about a painting. The Book of Saturday, what an interesting song. A song about the Great Deceiver or Fear of Flying or whatever it is. There's so many cool pictures he paints with his words. So anyways, that's all I got. So, did King Crimson have one more album in them?
Yeah, I don't think so, but that's only because I have the gift of hindsight, which is not fair, right? We know what comes next after this, and the fact that it's Robert Fripp turning into something completely different. It's not even the same band. It's not. So I think it's no, he was done. They wouldn't have had anything else to do together.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that's the other point is the next thing Robert Fripp does is ambient music with Brian Eno. And again, I think it's okay, you've done all the busy soloing. Now you're going to really work on soundscapes. And that's a cool next project to do. And I think with a musical brain like Robert Fripp, maybe you're okay, I've done, as I say, every single type of jazz metal I can think of. I've mined that particular vein to the core. What's the completely opposite thing I could do now?
How can I make something out of as few ingredients as possible?
Yeah. And genuinely, I was like, that's an interesting next step.
I don't know if this is the right way to describe it, but post Red, Robert Fripp really became much like a session musician. Like he shows up on a lot of things like Talking Heads, Blondie, Frank Zappa. You mentioned Brian Eno. I think David Bowie even. So it seems like he had to go out into the wilderness for a few years to figure out what he really wanted to do next.
Yeah, and I was going to say maybe that's another interesting point is, maybe he wanted to now work on himself as a guitarist rather than a composer. So maybe that was the next thing he had to do.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like all your examples, Brian's are really good ones there because he goes out, like those are big names that he goes out and plays with, right? And that lends itself to a totally different kind of practice.
And I know we've asked this question more than once on this podcast, but is King Crimson Robert Fripp? And I feel like at least the way we're discussing it, it seems like it really is. I don't know if we've answered it, but
I think this series of albums is the most multipolar King Crimson ever was. Obviously, Robert Fripp is the paprika in the stew here. But actually, no. I'll contradict myself right here, right now. No, Bill Bruford adds as much whatever. As I've said, I think John Wetton's grounding it a lot. And, maybe Jamie Muir and David Cross didn't have quite the same, artistic heft to battle with Robert Fripp, but they add their own flavor to the proceedings. But I genuinely think Robert Fripp, Bill Bruford going head-to-head with John Wetton holding down the middle, it's a tripartite band. And maybe this was the most equally distributed power there ever was in King Crimson.
One other perspective I'll raise. When In the Court of the Crimson King came out, Robert Fripp was 23.
Yep.
When Red came out, he was 28.
Yep.
So he's a 28-year-old with some of the most influential, most important prog albums, arguably most influential rock albums under his belt. It's kind of like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, all the Beatles were done by the time they were all 29. Like, were they even 30?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about what we as listeners think is like, oh, this is his life, this is the most important thing, but got a lot of life left when you're 28.
Yeah.
That's a super interesting point to make, is how, what a small part of his life it really is.
And actually, I was going to say, I think an even deeper point there is, fast forward to when we talk about how all these albums did, this album and the other albums do nothing commercially. And the other thing you might be thinking about at that point is, obviously, we now retrospectively like, oh, this is another masterpiece, it's another jewel in the tiara of Prague, or whatever it is. I think at the time they made this, you're just like, okay, I did my next vinyl because the studio funded me to do it, and I had to do something between tours. Again, sitting here, we're saying like, oh, could he have done one more, blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, you're just like, okay, this is a tree that's not really bearing much fruit, and as soon as it's not fun to do, like, who cares? Whatever, I'll go be a session musician. So I think on a grander level, it's amazing that any band lasts at all. And I think King Crimson, and to a lesser extent, yes, kind of lay the truth bare, but it's really hard to keep on the same creative page for, in the Rolling Stones case, 8 decades, let alone the stress of touring, business side, illicit substances, all that sort of the awfulness that goes with the life of a working musician. Well, most bands last 10 years and that's that. And I was going to say, I think Pink Floyd's the funny example of, they went the full 16 or something, and they hated each other the whole time. Basically no lineup change, just pure acrimony the whole time. So it was actually, it's pretty healthy to you play with your band, you do your album or two, and then you disintegrate. And I think it was King Crimson kind of laid bare that truth. So they're our most fractured band.
One other thing I think that differentiates Fripp from many of his peers is towards the 70s and 80s, 90s, he got very into musical education. He founded different schools and things to... Yeah. I mean, I think he's so opinionated about how to play the guitar. He's like, I literally have to teach the world how to play.
Yep.
And I can't think of, and I'm sure I'm wrong, but I can't really think of any other rock stars that gave back in such a way, such a consistent and formal way. I'm sure there's clips of John Mayer how to play the guitar, but not founding a school. He He founded a school that was in a old mansion in West Virginia, which he literally became like the Professor Xavier of the guitar world, like the Robert Fripp School for gifted guitarists.
Yeah. So I have very much enjoyed this 3-album arc, and I will leave you with this final thought about King Crimson in the form of a question. So what was their unique thing? So for my money, I think they are the most intricate and, dare I say, intimate of the mainstream, prog rock artists we've been covering. So they don't obviously have the stadium bombast of an ELP or a Yes, but like a Whisper, you have to lean in while they're playing. And I think, I talked a lot about the detail, but Bill's drums, like, they're impressive on a first pass, but then you listen to everything he's doing with rim shots and like cymbal work and all that sort of stuff. It's insane. Obviously, the weird tonalities bear re-listening. The mellotron and the violin playing off the guitar really like ask you to lean in. And then, as I have been saying, John's bass and voice really ground everything. And I would say I almost remember King Crimson more as a sound than any specific song.
Yeah. And if somebody asked you to describe that sound, where do you even start? Because we all throw around words like, oh, it's kind of jazzy, there's some metal, there's like, really, where would you even start to? I would have a very hard time doing that.
So I'd say lots of tempo shifting, lots of insane cymbal versus drum work, as in like Bill's going like lots of that kind of like scatting but with the drums, and then just a massive crunchy bass right in the middle. So that would be my first pass at it. But I don't know, like the Sphinxes of old, I have no idea what I would describe Robert Fripp's style as. Like, again, it's kind of like fine needlework or something, where it's always doing a little something.
Which is funny because actually the cover of Discipline is a bunch of knots, but it is like knitting, but it's truly original.
Yep.
He's truly an original.
Okay, so finally, Brian, Bobby Kreisgau for Red.
Bear with me, listeners. This is literally maybe the longest review he's ever done. We'll get through this together. Grand, powerful, grating, and surprisingly lyrical, with words that cast aspersions on New York City violence, Virtually at first for the Crims. This does for classical rock fusion what John McLaughlin's Devotion did for jazz rock fusion. The secret, as usual, is that Robert Fripp is playing more. He does remind me of McLaughlin, though he prefers to glide where McLaughlin beats his wings. In compensation, Bill Bruford supplies more action than Buddy Miles, less soul, though, which is why jazz rock fusion is more exciting. A-. That has to be the highest grade he's ever had.
I easily think it's the highest. Yep.
Just cutting through, he seems to respect Robert Fripp, is maybe where he's giving any of his love.
Which is fair enough. I have honestly no idea what his musical temperament is. Robert Kreisgau, this is. I have absolutely no idea what he actually likes.
Glam rock.
Okay, fabulous. So that was the Wetton/Bruford era of King Crimson. This has been a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. I have been your host, Ian Prize, and I want to thank my guest, Brian.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Brian. And Ryan.
Thanks for having me, Ian. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for being part of this 3-part epic adventure through the meadow that is King Crimson. Find us on ProgFrog Pod on Instagram or helloprogfrog@gmail.com if you have any longer thoughts, queries, or questions. So Red held the promise of this version of King Crimson going the distance, but as we said, Robert Fripp disbanded them before it even got released. So Bill would actually tour with Genesis next on their 1976 tour because Phil Collins was singing now, and then would go off onto a career of jazz fusion with, of course, the exception of his brief reunion with Yes, which we'll talk about months from now. John Wetton would be recruited to be the frontman of the supergroup Asia, and Robert Fripp would go off to live on a commune before returning to work on albums with David Bowie, Peter Gabriel, Brian Eno, etc., etc. before reforming King Crimson with a new drummer by the name of Bill Bruford for King Crimson's new phase in the 1980s. But for now, if you were thinking, I love jazz, but I've got madrigal fever, Dr. Ian's been checking your charts and he's got one prescription. Next time, we take a moderately deep dive into Gentle Giant. But before we go, I have only one question for you, Brian. Do you think our listeners want to hear about a normal-sized person that is very hard? I mean, it's a simple yes or no, Brian. If you were to describe just an average-heighted person who's just very hard, would our listeners want to hear about that?
I'm going to say yes.
Well, unfortunately for them, next week we'll be talking about Gentle Giant.
Oh, this is a gotcha question, Ian.
No, I put it in the notes